And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have on Todd WIlson. Todd, how are you this morning?
Doing well, Josh. Great to be with you.
So Todd is the co-founder and president of the Center for Pastor Theologians, and we'll actually talk about that in a minute. He holds degrees from Wheaton College, a PhD from Cambridge, MBA from Kellogg School of Management, and then he's also written about a dozen books. I met Todd about a year ago, and as we were working to live out our faith in public life, I just so appreciate Todd's reasoned, well thought out approach, his emphasis on Christians really understanding their faith and the resources of the church's history. And so I wanted to bring that to the audience today. We're going to talk about some specific topics like the application of theology to sexuality, which this is being recorded in Pride Month. But I'm so looking forward to just getting a bit of his wisdom. So Todd, would you jump in, explain a little bit about your ministry background and position? Also, tell us a little bit about your family. I was fascinated by that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I married my high school sweetheart, Katie. We just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary this week. And we both grew up on the north side of Indianapolis. And we have 7 children. 3 biological, 4 adopted, all from Ethiopia, the adopted children. And I sometimes describe myself as an academic caught in a pastor's body. I'm someone who loves the life of the mind and theology and really a lot of things. I think it's my Wheaton College liberal arts background where I'm interested in just about everything from economics and science to art and philosophy and all the rest of it. But kind of this academic bent, Josh, and also this pastoral wiring, love the local church and life and ministry of the church. Have served as a pastor for 15 years. And while I was serving as a pastor, was on the side leading with a colleague, the Center for Pastor Theologians, which we started in 2006. We were leading it part-time, just giving it part-time energies. And then in 2018, transitioned from leading the church I was the senior pastor of in Oak Park, Illinois, to going full-time with the Center for Pastor Theologians as the first full-time employee. So that was a bit of an adventure. And but God has been really good to help the ministry continue to grow and flourish and develop. And it's a great fit. So when people hear the word, perhaps folks that are listening hear the word theologian, I suspect what comes to mind is an academic, as a scholar, as someone in a seminary or a university faculty or something. That when they hear theologian, they probably don't think pastor, local church pastor. But in the history of the church, pastors have been theologians and theologians have been pastors in the vast majority of the history of the church until really the modern era, about 200 years ago, when you had this parting of the ways between pastors on the one hand and theologians on the other hand, and theology becoming an academic discipline done in an academic space rather than theology being the lifeblood, the discourse, the vernacular, the way in which pastors go about doing what it is they do, namely ministering God's word, which is intrinsically a theological task. You can't be in my view, an effective preacher and pastor without doing that theologically. If you're talking about God, you're talking theologically. If you're talking about the church, you're thinking and talking theologically. If you're engaging culture, doing it responsibly as a Christian, you are doing that theologically. Those are all theological tests. So anyways, the organization is to bring these two things back together again in the calling of the pastor as a theologian, not as an academic nerd, right? Like not pastor as academic nerd, pastor as I often will use the phrase thought leader, an ecclesially based thought leader who needs to help lead God's people and equip God's people to be faithfully present in the culture and in the world for Jesus. That's the gist of what I do and sort of my passion and interest in CPT and as a pastor theologian.
So it's so rich. And for those that were listening to this, you're thinking, oh boy, the word theologian, and their eyes are like starting to roll back in their head.
Yes.
But they're listening to a podcast Well, the host is a lawyer, so I don't know. Maybe they signed up for it.
This is right up your alley. These fine distinctions.
I don't know. But as I was pondering this after I met you and was looking at the website and the mission, the vision, it struck me just how effective some of the theologians or maybe effective, but also important, vital theologians have been in the church's history. Someone like St. Augustine navigating the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, someone like Martin Luther is, I think, safe to call him a theologian, where he's looking deeply in the scriptures, but then helping others understand them, applying it to their cultural moment. And then a stat hit me, I think last week or the week before, and listeners may be familiar with this. We've talked a lot about the stat that 6 to 7% of American Christians have a biblical worldview, according to Barna. But the most recent one, which just blew my mind, was something like 37% of pastors have a biblical worldview. Hold on.
What's the worldview they have?
How do you end up in this role? But also just the cultural change of the past. Like you think about the early republic, where the pastors are considered some of the most distinguished, learned individuals in a town, to now, like, they're a life coach that you can ask to come to your hospital. And pastoral care is important for sure, but certainly not considered somebody that's has a lot of knowledge, someone to look up to, a lot of wisdom. It's more just, hey, give us a good TED talk on Sunday, and we're good. And so the more I've thought about this, the more important, because as goes the pulpit, as goes the pastor, so goes the congregation.
Yes.
And so I know I've gone on a little bit, but the more I've thought about it, I'm like, oh, the more this is important. So I'm glad that you launched this. Before you dig a little deeper into that mission, would you share just maybe a recent story or experience how God's been working in your life?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, can I just make one comment when you said the pulpit as the pulpit goes, so goes the congregation? I think that's exactly right. There's this marvelous quote in the early chapters of Moby Dick about the preacher that's featured in the early chapters of Melville's novel Moby Dick, where there's this marvelous line that the pulpit leads the world is the line. The pulpit leads the world. It compares it to a ship, and it is sort of the front leading edge of the ship moving through the world. And I think that's exactly right. So, and I suspect that will resonate a lot with you, Josh, given your passions and interests on good citizenship and faithful citizenship in the world and world engagement as Christians. So the stakes are massively high, it seems to me, for substantive pastoral ministry and pastoral leadership, not just for equipping the church, but for cultural renewal and cultural engagement. So that was my free sermon with the podcast. Forgive me for that, Josh.
Oh, that's awesome.
What's got up to, so I mentioned we have 7 kids, and 2 are in college, 5 at home, 3 in middle school, 2 in high school. They're and that consumes a lot of calories. Parenting our large, complex family, and we're a mixed race family. So, just navigating contemporary issues with mixed race family. I'm raising 3 Black boys in America that are. We have 6 teenagers now.
That's all you need to say.
Right. 4 of whom are Black, 3 of whom are boys in America, in the era of George Floyd, in the era of CRT and anti-wokeness and wokeness, and on and on and on and on and on. So there just are a stunning number of really on the ground issues we have to grapple with, encourage our kids with, navigate prayerfully and thoughtfully, and frankly, learn. Like Katie and I, my wife and I, it's sometimes it's been kind of humbling, but we have to sometimes just be quiet and let our children teach us about how they're experiencing the world, what they're seeing in the world, what they're, and of course they're 13, 15, 16, our adopted kids. Right. So I mean, there's plenty that they still have to learn and grow and all the rest of it, but they see things and experience things in the world that my wife and I just never experienced, and wouldn't, and here's the thing, Josh, wouldn't even see if we couldn't see it through their eyes about the world, about society. So that's the vibrant, complex reality of our home life has always got us on the, on our tiptoes, just praying, thinking, trusting God, learning, growing, laughing, crying. So I could go on the rest of the podcast talking about family dynamics and stuff. So,
well, and I'm sure there are a number of listeners. Maybe that's a conversation for another day. But
sure,
it does show your heart of. I mean, this is, hey, we want to have the strong life of the mind, but you are living out those biblical principles. I mean, just one. Of course, we talk a lot about foster care and adoption on the podcast, and I can't imagine you have the international dynamic. You have the fact that they're adopted kids, and then you have all of this going on. So yeah, you have a number of things that you're having to navigate. But I just appreciate that, as we've had chances to talk, that you're looking at what does the Bible say, but then how can we humbly engage this moment, and doing that with 6 teenagers. So I'm sure there's got to be an award, or maybe next to jewel in your crown in heaven or something, for that. But thank you for sharing that. I know it's easy for us sometimes to talk about really high level issues, but that our first priority has to remain that family unit, and perhaps our greatest ministry is going to be done within the 4 walls of our home. So I appreciate that sense of priority there. So back to the CPT, Center for Pastor Theologians. You've explained a bit of its mission. Why? We've talked a little bit about how the pastor was seen as someone that, very reputable, learned, a source of wisdom, and how that's changed in American life. I don't think we have to explain that too far, but do you have any explanations, or could you track a little bit of how that happened, moving from kind of that thought leader to just somebody that gives a TED talk?
Yeah, great. I mean, there's a number of things, and I won't be able to give obviously a sort of totally sufficient explanation as to how that happened, but a lot of it is the result of the Enlightenment and the advent of the seminary and the modern research university, and the disciplinification, if I can create a really awkward word, of theology. Theology in the history of the church was a habit, was a virtue, almost like being a theologically oriented person. Yes, there's a discipline to it, but theology was what pastors and congregations did. This is how you think about worship and liturgy and preaching and prayer. These are all theological enterprises. The advent of the modern research university and the seminary in America, at least in the I think it's the 18 Andover Seminary in maybe 1830s or 40s. What that ends up doing is, as it were, pulling theology out of the life of the local church and into the academy, and changing the nature of theology and the way we think about theology. So now theology is an academic discipline for smart PhD people. It's not what local churches do. Local churches do ministry, they do outreach, they do evangelism, they do preaching, they do congregational care, they do et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of parting of the ways of theology out of the life of the church and into the life of the academy has 2 impacts, major impacts. The one is it makes theology, the way we talk about it at the CPT is theology becomes ecclesially anemic, right? It loses its ecclesial, its churchly focus. It's no longer relevant for God's people. It no longer is a discipline or a way of thinking and speaking that emerges from the concerns of the church and returns to the life of the church. It's now what academics do. They write papers and do all this kind of thing. So it becomes ecclesially, churchly anemic, like lacking church blood cells running through it, right? On the other hand, for the church, as theology leaves the church becomes theologically anemic, which means it becomes pragmatic. It's no longer its lifeblood its framework for decision making and moving into the world and so on and so forth is no longer theological, it's pragmatic. And when it's pragmatic, what you will do, if you're not looking to the 2,000-year history of the church for your resources, for your lifeblood, you're going to be looking, if you've gone to kind of a primarily a pragmatic orientation, like you're going to be asking questions like, what works? And when you're in that frame of mind, you're going to be looking to the culture for what works in the culture. Like how do you grow a church, right? Like what marketing strategies do you need to grow a church? Or what's a compelling way to communicate with people in a space? Well, dim the lights, put them in theater seating, have smoke and lights shining down. And as you've already referred, like give a compelling 17-minute TED talk. And obviously I'm characterizing a little bit here, but you get the point. It's like the theology leaving the life of the church becomes highly pragmatic. When the church becomes highly pragmatic, it becomes highly consumeristic and responsive and reactive to the movements and the culture rather than the rich resources of the Christian faith and Christian tradition. And the downstream effect of that, sorry, I'm going on a little long here. The downstream effect of that is the church begins to look a lot like the world. And when the church looks a lot like the world, it doesn't have anything to say to the world. It doesn't have any compelling message for the world. It doesn't have any, more important than the message even, it doesn't have any compelling way of life that's different than the world. It's the old-fashioned term is it's worldly. It's quite worldly in its message, its thinking, but more importantly in its living. And we have seen over the last couple of years stunning, heartbreaking, tragic examples of the worldliness of the evangelical church. Think about the report that just dropped about the executive committee and the culture of the SBC. And I don't want to paint with a massive broad brushstroke there. So think about how tragic and sad that is. That is not commending the Christian faith to a watching world, frankly. So that's part of the explanation for what's happened there. Let me say one other thing as well about that, just add one more layer, which is the history of Protestantism in North America in particular. And at the
Love it.
end
We're covering like these massive topics.
Yes,
You're doing a great job covering. It's
okay,
like,
sorry.
hey, summarize all of religious history in the United States. Go, Todd. No, that was awesome, the last one. Okay, so I'm looking forward to this one.
Listeners, this will be the last time you hear from me. Josh is never inviting me back.
No, this is awesome.
So the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, you had the influx of modern, what we would now call liberalism, higher learning, critical learning, university. So you had sort of like Freud, Nietzsche, Darwin, these influences coming, landing, as it were, on the church. Very destabilizing and unsettling. And one of the moves, and then you had all the kind of battles happening in institutions as they were liberalizing to try to accommodate Darwinism and Freud and Nietzsche and all this. They're liberalizing, but then you had factions within that didn't want to liberalize. They wanted to stay conservative and anchored to historic Protestant Christianity. And this created a huge parting of the ways that we call the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And the advent of fundamentalism, which is, you might say, very conservative Protestantism, historic Protestantism, that's responding, reacting, and resisting the liberalizing, modernizing of the church and then American culture more broadly. So think of like a crescendoing with the Scopes monkey trial and all the stuff involved with that. And then fundamentalism developing, right, in the early 1900s for about 50 years until the advent of neo-evangelicalism with people like Billy Graham and Christianity Today and Fuller Seminary and Wheaton College, these kinds of institutions kind of coming online and some of them being founded. And Wheaton obviously wasn't founded then, but it kind of in this neo-evangelical mold, which was more culture engaging than resisting, whereas fundamentalism is much more culture resisting than engaging. Basic kind of difference between evangelicals and fundamentalists. In that fundamentalist era, you had a lot of sort of stepping back from and resisting culture engagement. It was a bit more, and I don't want to be pejorative or unfair in my characterization, but it was a bit more of a kind of step back in within the secure confines of the Christian faith and conservative Christianity, and resist liberal learning and cultural trends and movements, and as it were, sort of hunkered down within it. And Christians did that, conservative Protestants, for about 50 years, until the advent of neo-evangelicalism, as they, as it were, dropped the drawbridge and went back out into the culture, engaging the culture. I say all that just to say that legacy and that disposition of resisting culture in order to preserve the faith, that has some advantages to it, right? Like preserving the faith. The challenge is a lack of thoughtful, serious engagement with the major trends and issues in the culture. Largely, it's a critical reaction to, rather than a thoughtful and substantive engagement with. And so part of what we're doing at the CPT, to bring this back full circle, is helping thoughtful, biblically minded Protestant Christians take up that responsibility to not fear the culture primarily, but to engage the culture thoughtfully, faithfully, winsomely. Not compromise, and not making our faith relevant by making lots of compromises. That's not what we're talking about. Talking about a serious, thoughtful, substantive engagement, the kind of stuff you talk about in your book on citizenship. What does this look like to stay faithful to your convictions, but engaged in the culture and in the world?
That's so rich. And I'm sure listeners can kind of sense why we connected, because on one hand, and I think my favorite description of this kind of heady academic bent that doesn't do much for the world was the description in the Middle Ages of, I think it was Catholic theologians arguing about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin while the walls of Constantinople are literally being blown apart by cannons.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly.
Well, we got to figure this out. And we can fall into that, but also just that description of, we often talk about that inclination to just withdraw. And I think that's, sometimes Christians ask me, like, well, how can the sexual revolution be moving so quickly? How could things be changing so quickly? Like, well, it looks like it's happening fast, but it's actually been going on for more than 100 years. And we're just now seeing the results of it. So it's kind of this flywheel principle, and that plays into how do you respond well to something that's been developing that long. But I just I appreciate how you're trying to navigate this, and it's much easier to just withdraw or to just give in. But to do this, faithful engagement, that's the hard part. Just one last thought as you were moving forward. I've wrestled a lot over the last decade with how can we have so many churches? I mean, drive through many communities, not just in the Bible Belt, but throughout the United States. Church, and how can we have such a weak prophetic voice when it comes to things that are Orthodox Christian beliefs, things like marriage, things like the body? And it's as if we have no voice and no credible voice in culture. And a part of it, it seems to me, is what you've described of, well, we're constantly, if we don't have this really strong theological drive, it's that pragmatism that can take over. And it's just, it's not helpful to guests on a Sunday, or maybe the budget, when you start talking about culturally unpopular positions. And I'm not accusing anyone of cowardice. I'm probably just saying the way the model's been set up, that's just what gets celebrated. That's just what's, feels more natural, and what actually continues to build what we think we need to be building. And so when you first mentioned that to me, I think, wow, that really explains so much, that the strong theological convictions of the church, if they're not there, we just end up looking up like the rest of the culture. So just a lot there in that question. So how practically, so we've kind of talked about the problem, how practically is CPT working to address this problem? And you've mentioned seminaries a couple of times. I assume that you're still in favor of seminaries, but is that system need to be tweaked some, or maybe we need to shut them all down? I'm not sure but what is the what are some practical ways the CPT is addressing this?
Yeah, great. That's a great great question, and I'll try to. I'm sorry, I give long answers, so I'll try to be a little more succinct on this answer, or the way we think about this. That theology leaving the church and becoming an academic discipline, like an academic kind of discipline in the worst sense. There's good theology happening. I don't mean to paint with that massive brush, but becoming an academic discipline in the church, losing its theological lifeblood, right? The problem is seminaries are in this academic mode and mold. So you have someone who wants to become a pastor. They grow up in the local church, they love the life of the local church, etc. And then we ship them off to a seminary for 3+ years to get an MDiv or whatever. And they are learning theology, how to read the Bible, how to think about God, how to think about the church, how to think about cultural engagement as a Christian in an academic discipline in an academic institution that is in some respects cut off from the life of the church. Then they graduate with this pretty sophisticated degree after 3 years of learning Greek and Hebrew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can talk about Augustine and they can talk about, all this stuff. And then they land back in the life of the local church and they open their mouth on a Sunday morning and all the congregation's like, what did he just say? like, can someone sort of translate what's happening with this person? Because I heard something about a Greek participle and something about supralapsarianism or whatever, and I have no idea what any of this means, right? So there's this, and seminaries recognize this challenge. They recognize what we're producing is not resonating deeply with churches, which is why seminaries are shrinking across the country and struggling. Many of the leading seminaries, evangelical seminaries, are struggling significantly because the value proposition is not as compelling as it once was. To churches and aspiring pastors, they're like, if I go off to seminary, it's going to cost a ton of money, ton of time, and I'm not sure it's actually going to prepare me to be a faithful, fruitful pastor. And seminaries recognize this. So they try to figure out, how do we make what we're doing more relevant and meaningful for the life of the church? And so, they'll do things like spiritual formation. We need more spiritual formation. We need more internships. We need more practical ministry exposure for our graduates, et cetera, et cetera. Our take on that is that the genre of education is wrong. That is to say, if you want to train pastors for ministry, they need to be trained in ecclesial theology, what we call ecclesial theology, which is theology that emerges from the life of the church and is for the life of the church, not in academic theology, which is for the discipline of theology as an academic enterprise, not as a churchly enterprise. So that's one of our big sort of critiques. Seminaries are doing a ton of good. I don't want to sort of bash and thrash seminaries by any means. I do want to say what they're wrestling with how do we train pastors more effectively, I think can make some strides and move forward in that by thinking differently about the whole genre in which education takes place, so that you're learning how to be a pastor from people for whom this is their calling in life. They are churchly people primarily, first and foremost, and they think about preaching and teaching and interpreting scripture and all the rest of it from a churchly vantage point, not primarily from an academic vantage point.
That's helpful. And we'll certainly link to the website, and you could learn more about the resources, books, fellowships, conferences that CPT puts on. And so if you're a pastor listening to this and you got one of those kind of fancy degrees, you could probably feel some of this tension even in your own education. Yeah. And I've spoken to a number of those graduating from seminary as, I understand all of this, but I'm more from a legal perspective. I don't know how to run a large, small business. I didn't receive some of that more practical training. And like you said, I think seminaries are aware of these things and they're trying to change them. And I wanted to pivot now because as you talked about the pulpit, I think was it the pulpit leads the world. I love that. Yeah. I'm gonna have to go find that quote in Moby Dick. Yes. But then now, not only do the pastors need to be theologians in a sense, we talked earlier about the concept of public theologians, of
Yes.
The average, committed Christian, that mom, that dad, the average citizen stepping out into the public square, being deeply rooted in what the Bible says and how to engage culture. And certainly one of the major issues, since this is Pride Month, we're recording in, that is coming at the church these days is the issue of sexuality. And you have actually written extensively on this topic. So I want to kind of shift into this next part of the conversation and talk about that. So you've edited a book titled Beauty, Order, and Mystery, a Christian vision of human sexuality. I actually have a copy of that one here. And then also a book called Mere Sexuality, which I think was a play maybe on Mere Christianity.
Yes.
But would you explain a bit of the kind of the thesis of those works? And when you're talking about the biblical view of sexuality, what's kind of a high level point that you want to get across to Christians?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the two books would just speak to those first. The Beauty, Order, and Mystery is a bringing together in book form of talks that were given at the CPT conference that we host each year in Chicago in October. In this conference that we did a number of years ago on sexuality. So it is not so much a thesis per se, because it's probably 15 or 18 individual contributions from different speakers, all kind of hovering around and grappling with what does a Christian vision of sexuality look like in the contemporary world that's faithful to Scripture, that's theologically responsible, but is also sort of, again, engaged with culture. I can speak more to the thesis of the Mere Sexuality book, which I wrote. And it is a play on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And one of the things the book began life as a sermon series I preached back in, was it 2015 or 2015, right after Obergefell and the legalization of same-sex marriage. And I had the sermon series planned for the fall. I preached it in the fall before the court case dropped, before the Supreme Court made its ruling. So it was providentially timed. And the gist of what I was trying to do in the book is basically say there is a theological vision of human sexuality that represents the consensus view of the history of the church for centuries. And what we're struggling with as a church is that we lack this theological vision. The logic, you might say the deep logic of the Christian view on sexuality no longer makes sense to people, not just people in the culture, but people in the church. All that we've got, the church, so to speak, and again, I'm gonna be overly simplify, so just indulge me here, but all we've got is a handful of Bible proof texts that speak to same-sex practice negatively, and that's about it. So what is if you're to ask a teenager in your church, what does the Bible say about sexuality? They would tell you, a few things, and maybe there's a few Bible verses or something associated with that. They wouldn't be able to tell you, and probably your average adult. But the Christian tradition, the Christian faith, and Scripture itself, not just proof texts, this passage, this kind of, but the entire vision of Scripture about what it means. And here's the key, Josh: what it means to be a human being is compelling and lays out for us like how to think about sexuality. So let me just try to summarize it real quick this way. The punchline of the book, Mere Sexuality, is basically to say your body matters for sexuality. Your body matters. Embodiment matters. When God created human beings in his image, Genesis 1:27, male and female, let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. At the very core of what it means to be a creature, human being made in the image of God, is this sexual dimorphism, right? Is this sexual distinction between being male and female that is right in the opening, literally, page and chapter of the Bible. anchored in the image of God, what it means to be in the image of God. That's a way of saying our bodies matter, male body and female body. And that determines and that shapes and ought to inform everything about human community. And then, of course, human sexuality. Or I put it this way in the book, almost everything in Christian sexual ethics flows from this basic insight, Christian insight, that we are male and female embodied creatures, that our bodies matter. We aren't human beings persons who happen to have bodies. Frankly, that's a pagan way of thinking about it, right? The pagans were like, you have a soul, that's the really important part of you, and it's housed in this body. But the body's housing is kind of optional. You're going to get rid of it when you die, and that'll all be better for you, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a Christian view. The Christian view is we are a embodied soul. We are a unity, an integrated unity of body and soul, and our bodies are essential to our identity and person. And that basic theological insight is a game changer for sexuality. Everything flows from that. Why Christians believe in heterosexual, lifelong, monogamous marriage? Why? I mean, just on and on and on. Why we resist abortion, for example. Why Christians cannot easily make a distinction between person and human being, as one has to do if you're going to have be supportive, typically, of abortion. You have to distinguish between the Homo sapien that comes together as a zygote in a mother's womb and the person who, as it were, develops later. Christians with a robust sort of theological way of thinking about what it means to be a human being don't have that option. So it impacts everything. That's the gist of mere sexuality.
And that's beautiful. And I think that most specifically responds to the transgender movement. And I have admitted to listeners that I had not developed a strong kind of theological understanding of the body until recently. I just never read, I guess maybe I didn't think it was that as relevant.
Yes.
But one of the things we often say is that Christianity is both true and good. And I think it's that grand narrative, I love the title, Beauty, Order, and Mystery, that there is something beautiful to the Christian understanding of the body and meaningful.
Yes.
I've mentioned on the podcast before, have a guest on named Ben Shatler, who speaks at a lot of Christian camps. He's moved his more traditional kind of salvation sermon, kind of going through the Romans road, from the first night to later in the week. And he leads with a sermon on human identity. And he talks about how many kids will come forward and commit their lives to Christ after that vision being presented to them in a way that maybe they didn't understand before. But maybe would you dig into this vision just a little bit, maybe thinking about speaking to a teenager? I'm sure maybe you've had some practice of what that vision means for human sexuality as it relates to claims of homosexuality, or, just the only line in our society more, this blurry line of consent. So go sleep with whoever you want, as long as it feels good. What is the positive Christian vision in response?
No, it's great. And part of the work is starting with the cultural narrative and way of thinking about these things, which is expressive individualism. Your listeners may have heard that phrase. Like, how does the typical secular person, or frankly, like religious person who hasn't thought through these issues from a theological perspective, like the way of thinking about what it means to be a human being is expressive individualism. Like, the really important thing about you is what's going on inside of you. It's your feelings, it's your sense of self. And the goal of life is to express that as freely as possible. So the idea of expressive individualism. And in that view, what's going on inside of you, your feelings, your thoughts, your sense of self, that's the true you. The body then just becomes a tool you use to enhance or express the true you. But here's the catch. The body is not the true you. Your body is not the true you. It's not essential to your identity. And again, that's a pagan way of thinking about human personhood. That's not a historically Christian way of thinking about human personhood. And when you have that distinction between the true you and your embodiment, or your body, it allows for lots of things. It allows for hookup culture. as I sometimes say when I teach on this, how could a self-respecting person engage so easily in the hookup culture where you're on Tinder and you're doing a one-night stand and using your body that way? And I think this is the key. The key is that people have bought into the idea that, like, yeah, I'm just using my body. It's not actually me. The body's a tool. It's not me. And so if I use my body for sexual titillation and sexual experience enhancement, that's fine. That's not really me. Whereas if you're a Christian, your body is you, and you are your body. And what happens to your body is happening to you, your person. You can't make that distinction. I think that's a much more realistic way of thinking about the human person, right? And a Christian way of thinking about the human person. But so you see this, if listeners catch anything, and what I'm trying to say, is this integral connection between embodiment and personhood as a Christian, and it will unlock almost everything happening in our culture today if you understand that the cultural narrative on sexuality is supported by a view of what it means to be a person, where the person is different than their body. This explains, again, hookup culture, transgenderism. I mean, transgenderism is the full flourishing of this, right, Josh?
Yeah.
Where we now live in a world where it's an astonishing thing, really, where someone can conclude that they have been born into the wrong body. Now, think about that. I am in the wrong body because I am fundamentally different than my embodiment.
There's so much there, and I'll certainly encourage listeners to pick up both of these books to think about it. But that vision of the body as especially for the believer, as the temple of the Holy Ghost,
Yes.
and not as a canvas for like self-expression, as you've
Yes.
talked about.
Yes.
And that when we come to an eroticized culture, it's so easy to give into this. Well, it doesn't really matter, it's everyone else is doing it. But to hold to that view that your body is sacred, it's holy.
Yes.
And we know we can answer the question, what is my body for?
Yes.
And we understand that purpose in the context of even just our body, but also the context of marriage and sexuality. And so the more I've thought about it, in a world completely lost, as far as there being any rules or any reason for our bodies or sexuality, the more I've thought about it, the more, again, that beauty, order, and mystery has become apparent. And so I'm grateful that you've put that out there, and there's so much to mull on. I know we're coming close to our time, but there was one other element in your book that fascinated me that I wanted to ask you about, and that was what I was thinking about. I read the title at first. I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm kind of dancing on blasphemy, or I don't know, hearse or something. But
I think I know where you're headed with this question, Josh.
But talking about the sexuality of Jesus. All right, so maybe listeners can understand my can we talk about this? I don't know.
A lot of your listeners just turn the podcast off, Josh.
They're like, cool. Oh, I don't want lightning to strike my car.
Yes.
No, I had thought about it in the context of Hebrews 4:15. He was tempted as we are, yet without sin. Obviously, Jesus was embodied. He had a body, fully man, and therefore must have endured some of the same temptations, sexual temptations that any other human would. But would you dig into that a little bit as you studied that, and what are some of the lessons we can draw from it?
Yeah, no, great. Well, when I use the word sexuality and apply it to Jesus, of course, I'm not thinking about sexual activity. I'm thinking about being an embodied person, having a body, and not just having a body like an amorphous asexual body, having a sexed body. The Son of God is a male, like has a sexed body. And so the role of this chapter in the book and the argument of the book plays it's the first chapter after the introduction, because it's trying to put the Christian vision of sexuality on a really strong theological foundation, which must begin with Jesus and the incarnation and the resurrection. So to put it in fancy theological terms, Christology, the teaching and thinking, how we think about Christ, needs to be the foundation for our theological anthropology, how we think about what it means to be a human being. You and I, we get our cues on what it means to be human from looking primarily at the person of Jesus, who is the human being par excellence. So he is our model. And what do we learn from Jesus? We learn in the incarnation, a couple of things, but through the incarnation, that God, the Son, has embraced human nature fully and joyfully forever. So this is the mind-blowing thing, is he's affirming the goodness of our creaturely embodiment, that these bodies that you and I have, being an embodied creature, being with a sex body, male or female, this is not some liability. This is beauty, order, goodness, truth. This is a beautiful thing that God the Son has embraced through the incarnation. And then the resurrection. So the start of Jesus' life, the end of Jesus' life, the resurrection. Here's the game-changing thing, I think, that Christians tend not to think about. Jesus didn't have a body. Jesus, check it out, has a body. Present tense. The Son of God is raised from the dead, embodied. In a transformed body, in a resurrected body, but he's embodied. He's not sort of left his embodiment behind and now he's back just as a pulsating God light. That's not the Christian teaching. The Christian teaching is Jesus is we will be able to know, recognize Jesus in his, he's embodied. Yeah,
with the nail scarred hands, right?
With the nail scarred hands, right? Exactly. So he is still, check it out, a embodied, incarnate Jewish male who has the scars and the wounds on his body. And when he returns to judge the living and the dead and usher us into the new creation, we will see him in all of his resurrected glory with the scars still. That's a way of saying, Josh, embodiment goes on forever. We're not pagans and we're not Gnostics. We're Christians. We believe in the resurrection of the body. We don't believe in dying, leaving our body behind and going to heaven as a disembodied spirit. We believe in the resurrection of the body. That's the Christian hope, that Jesus is the forerunner of. That's a game changer. That means these bodies are going to be around forever in glorified form, but embodied forever and ever, just as Jesus is. That changes the way we now think about sexuality, that our embodiment really matters. And then the last piece is the beginning of life, incarnation, the end of Jesus' life, resurrection, then all the middle. And what we learn from the middle of like Jesus's life, earthly life, as the embodied incarnate Son of God, is that sexual activity and sexual expression is not essential to a flourishing human life. It's a good, it's not that it's bad. Genesis 1 and 2, naked, unashamed. God has a very, if I can put it this way, high view of sex. God designed it. It's beautiful. It reflects the beauty and glory of God. It's not that it's bad. It's that it's not essential to human flourishing. And Wilson, how could you possibly say that? Well, who's the most flourishing human being who ever walked the face of the earth? Jesus Christ. And what do we know about Jesus? Jesus never engaged in any sexual activity. And yet he was the most flourishing human being ever, ever. Not easy, but flourishing. And that is an unbelievably countercultural message. Because in our culture today, to deny or resist or neglect sexual expression is like, as viewed by the culture as puritanical and anti-human, non-human. I mean, like that's about the most regressive thing you can do as a human being would be to deny yourself free and full sexual expression. Christians just have a very different vision and model of that. But let me just underscore one other thing about that, which is the Christian message is not, well, because sexuality is dirty and bad and all the rest of it, and we don't really need it. And so we're just going to kind of do the purity culture and not kind of be into sex. And the pagans and non-Christian secular world, they do all that. And we're like good and goody two-shoes over here. And we, that's not the way we ought to think about it. We ought to think about like sex is awesome. Sex is awesome. God has designed it. It's stunning. It's beautiful. It ought to thrill our hearts and minds. within and be expressed within God-designed parameters. That's the balancing act we ought to live with.
Wow. So that was worth the price of admission right there, ladies and gentlemen. That was amazing.
Can I say one other thing, John? You're seeing.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
This is what needs to be taught to children and to adults, but retaught to adults, but to children. Is this thing called sex needs to be handled with such care because it is so good and beautiful and powerful. You bring two human bodies together of the opposite sex and you engage in sexual intercourse, you can bring forth another eternal being.
Wow.
God has given us the most stunning power through sex. It's mind-blowing. And it's the most beautiful thing, the bringing together of these two different bodies as persons in sexual intercourse in the context of a marriage that's committed to till death do us part, because it's likely going to bring about children who need that lifelong commitment of parents so that they can grow into all that God wants them to be, on and on. Like, this whole Christian story about sexuality is so spectacular. And this is what needs to be preached and sung about and celebrated in the church and then in the world. Because the world, it's not as though it's working out so well for the world. Like, what does the world really have going? I mean, like, porn industry, Me Too movement. I mean, as though relationships between men and women are getting better in our culture. They're not. It's like, there's so much consternation and hurt and wounding, and they're looking for a narrative, a story that's not just true and good, but here's the thing, beautiful. And the church needs to reclaim this theological vision of sexuality so that we can commend it with a smile on our face as beautiful to the world, not just as true. And if you can come and be prissy like us and be over here and have it right. No. Like, beautiful, joy-filled, dynamic, compelling. That's what the Christian church needs to, in my view, recover and then live out in the world. All right, end of sermon. Sorry, that was another sermon, brother.
That was so powerful. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to that. And as you mentioned, the counterculture, the more compelling narrative is what I would frame the Christian narrative as. It looks at the current culture and says, well, who's truly in control here? I think Burke often talks about how our passions can forge our fetters.
Yes.
And, the breakdown of the nuclear family in the United States, the rise of STDs, the sense of loneliness and anxiety, the hookup culture, the denigration of women. Yeah, I mean, it's working out great. The way we do sexuality is so effective in this country.
That's right.
If we get past it feels good, and that because it's so strong, because God's planted that into us as sexual beings, because it's so strong, we want to just be able to do whatever we want. But I think most rational, reasonable people would step back and say, you know what, it's not working for us.
Yes.
And it's having profound impact in our culture. Just one last example before we move on. Maybe we should have just done the whole podcast on this, but this is all so good. We've asked a number of elected officials over the last couple of years, and this would be across the political aisle. What is the worst problem in your district? Almost an immediate response, the breakdown of the nuclear family.
Yes.
And where and there are a lot of reasons for that, but again, this all comes back to, what is our sexuality for? What is marriage designed to be? What is its purpose? And we've just completely chucked that out the window and expect to be able to have a flourishing republic. So amen to everything that you shared. There's so much there. It's certainly something I'll continue to mull over. So
can I just say one thing, Josh? Sorry.
Please.
For listeners to appreciate that when we cut against the grain of human nature, it doesn't go so well. when we cut against the grain of human nature. We have been created to be certain kinds of creatures who have a nature, and when we cut with the grain of our human nature, as we've been designed, we flourish and thrive. And when we cut against it, not so well. And I think we're seeing in the culture, and I think we'd say in the church, insofar as we have drunk deep from the wells of the culture, we see a lot of cutting against the grain of human nature, which is creating a lot of heartache and challenges both inside the church and outside the church.
And definitely something, as you mentioned, we come to with a sense of deep brokenness, or at least an inability to at all times fully live up to Christ's example. And so when we come to a culture and we're talking to someone about fornication or some variance from God's design, we can do so humbly, admitting that, hey, we live in a sexualized culture as well, and these forces pull and tear at us. But we're all saying, hey, here's what Jesus says: pick up your cross daily and follow me. So it's just beautiful and powerful. As we kind of wrap up here, one kind of practical question, again, as public theologians, pastor theologians, it seems to me in our current cultural moment, if I could try to grind down a host of controversies, whether it's the use of preferred pronouns in a public school setting, using preferred pronouns in your email, attending a same-sex wedding ceremony, all these questions come up. It seems to me the concept is, on one hand, we are to love our neighbors well. We are to do everything we can to reach out to them, minister to them, show them that we see them as fellow image bearers, even if we deeply disagree with their positions. But on the other hand, we cannot do anything, and this would be an issue of conscience, at kind of where the line is, but we cannot do anything that celebrates or affirms that which is not true and that cuts against our side. Because if we do that, we come back to being the church that has nothing to say, it seems to me. Would you critique that divide, or do you have a different take on it?
It's great. Well, I mean, these are the $64,000 questions, right? Of how to be a faithful Christian presence in a pluralist democracy where it's post-Christian. And so on really basic things that, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, there was a broad, widespread cultural consensus that was largely aligned around historic Christianity, Protestantism in particular. Like, that's now is disappearing and dissipated. So these are really challenging issues. And also, I think we need to go back and recover the resources, to pick up our earlier theme, of the Christian church and faith from the early centuries of the church. If we think we're living in a complicated world in 21st century America, just imagine what it would have been like living as a first century Christian in pagan Rome. I mean, this is Disneyland compared to what that would have been like in terms of complexity and non-Christian. And so there are tons of resources for us in the scriptures and in the early history of the church as to how to be a faithful, Jesus-honoring presence in a very challenging cultural moment and environment. I totally agree with you that Christians shouldn't, and nor should anybody, celebrate and affirm things that they don't believe are true, right? And that's not just something unique to Christians. Human beings shouldn't have to do that, because as Christians, we should honor that everybody's made in the image of God, and everybody has, as it were, a freedom of conscience. We don't want to compel anyone's conscience. That's a deep, long-standing Christian commitment. And so we wouldn't want a secular culture or society or government to compel our conscience, to have us affirm and celebrate things that we don't affirm and celebrate, nor would we want the government to do that for anybody else. So Christians need to develop a robust doctrine of tolerance, and how living in our pluralist democracy, tolerance. And we were talking before you hit the record button, Josh, but of the kind of classic liberalism, not liberal conservative in the kind of political sense, but John Lockean liberal vision of living with our deep differences and honoring, respecting each other's dignity, even when we deeply disagree and are deeply divided. Christians need to be at the forefront of embodying that kind of way of living in our culture. Sadly, I don't think we're often known. I don't think we're known that way. I think we're known as like wanting often to dominate other people, culturally or even politically, wanting to dominate, wanting to impose on other people. And I don't think that's the right way forward for Christians, because we don't want to compel other people's conscience to affirm and celebrate things they don't think are true. So that's one thing. And then tolerance. But I would say this, I think Christians have a responsibility to do more than tolerance or resistance. We have a responsibility, I think, to do hospitality, which is risky and complicated. And you're going to probably make mistakes when you do hospitality. It's one thing to tolerate. It's one thing to respect differences or whatever. It's another thing to enfold into your life in a meaningful way people who disagree deeply with you. To take the risk, the sacrificial risk of being hospitable. Like just like you'd show hospitality by inviting somebody over for dinner who is a stranger. What does that look like for Christians to practice hospitality in the public sphere, in the public square? So we were kicking around gender pronouns and the use of that, and that's a very sensitive issue for Christians. And I, I've thought some about that. I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert on how to handle that issue, but I would probably err, Josh, on the side of showing hospitality to other people in honoring the way in which other people want to be, the way in which they want to be referred. Even if you have disagreements like at a philosophical or theological level about what that means, it's showing a kind of loving generosity and hospitality and living in that tension. And I'm not saying that's an easy tension. And I would want to just affirm, like, Christians will have different issues. Some of your listeners right now are thinking, what's this Wilson dude saying? I totally disagree with that. And that's totally fine. I get that. I'm just saying the way I think about this is that there's room for us as Christians to stay faithful to our convictions, but show a lot more hospitality towards culture rather than just resistance and critique of the culture, that I think will commend the Christian faith in the culture and make a more peaceable culture, which I think we all want, a less polarized and embattled culture.
And I certainly see a difference there in kind of the setting, so like you mentioned,
Yes.
the hospitality / ministry setting versus the state or even a company telling you must do this.
Yep.
And I think Christians have kind of distinguished those, and that's helpful.
Yep.
But I do agree that, like, what's the danger? Perhaps, a lot of our audience is going to be more conservative.
Yep.
Evangelical Christians have strong Orthodox views on these issues. Our temptation is probably not going to be to compromise on the truth. And if it is, go listen to the rest of what we just talked about, because you just set out an incredible, historic view of what the Bible says on these issues. I think it's about as Orthodox as it gets. So I'm not sure that that's our danger as much as it is those people. I don't want to even be close to them, because then I may be accused of compromising.
Totally.
So I that's certainly what I take away from this
Yes.
Admonition of, are you engaging? Are you leaning in? Like, are you searching for some of those relationships? I think that's probably the greater danger in our cultural moment. And hey, totally. I see what culture is trying to do. I see it's trying to cancel us. I see all of those things. But what is the Christian response? Jesus, having a meal with a tax collector was about the most scandalous thing, politically.
This is, as you were starting to talk, Josh, as you were talking, immediately my mind is, our Lord was accused not of what John the Baptist was accused of, which is, this guy lives out in the wilderness. He's like an ascetic, and he's a prophet, and he's decrying moral evil. And all. That's not what Jesus was accused. Jesus was accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. There was a way in which Jesus moved into complicated, messy places and spaces and with people in a loving way that did not compromise one iota of anything but showed a kind of cruciform way of moving in the world that I just think probably most of us, certainly me, we're not willing to lovingly take those kinds of risks. We're too afraid, we're too fearful, we're too scared. And that's where I think we need to grow in the love of Christ and not be so fear driven with everything, but having the love of Christ compel us into these messy places and spaces.
So if you had just maybe 2 or 3 quick, like practical habits. So, how do we become and remain either a pastor's theologian if we're in the pulpit, or in a sense, a public theologian as a Christian citizen trying to live out our faith? What are some maybe, 2 to 3 really practical things that Christians can do to ensure that they're doing that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, let me kind of meat and potatoes is read your Bible. Read your Bible. And I don't mean like spend 3 minutes reading a devotional that has a Bible verse in it. I mean, read your Bible, and preferably with a pen and a journal open, where you are thinking, yes, praying, but you're devotionally reading the Bible, thinking about the vision of God and the world and human beings and human community that's emerging out of the pages of Scripture. As you're doing that under the lordship of Jesus in worship and adoration of God, to walk as a faithful Christian in the world, you're thinking things through. You're letting your mind be conformed to the logic and the vision of Scripture. So read your Bible and read it seriously, like engage it seriously. That'd be 1. 2 would be read theology. And I don't mean read like nerdy academic books that are hard to understand with lots of footnotes. I mean, find things that are theologically substantive but accessible and engage with those. So without it sounding too self-serving, like grab Mere Sexuality, the book I wrote. That's not super complicated theology, but it is a theological way of thinking about human sexuality. And that's just an example that's close to me because I wrote the book. But those sorts of things, and there are lots of resources like that that can just sharpen the way normal, everyday Christians engage the world and think about issues. That would be the second thing. Third thing I would commend is to be kind of grounded in and meaningfully engaged in a thoughtful, biblically driven, theologically minded local church, where you're doing life together with other Christians, you're sitting under the preaching and teaching of God's word on a regular basis, and that whole experience is just shaping your virtues, habits, instincts, and vision of the world. And then lastly, fourth thing I would say is befriend people with whom you have deep differences and invite them over for dinner and talk about substantive things that you're going to disagree about, and do it in a way that's calm and emotionally differentiated. Right? Like if you're a conservative Christian who tends to vote Republican, find a Democrat who thinks Christianity is kind of dopey and go out and have dinner with them and talk about stuff, but don't get overly emotionally reactive. Be curious and try to understand why it is, how it is they view the world and why they view it that way. And listen and ask curious questions. To really, don't assume and you're just letting them get set up so you can critique it. Listen. Like, we're not always that good at listening. So to listen and then find points of contact and connection. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, even if we have wildly different worldviews. We're all human beings who have a human nature that is oriented in the same direction. We just tend to go about it in different ways. But find that, so those points of contact, those longings in the human heart that the Christian faith speaks to in a more compelling way. Those moves in the cultural narrative that the Christian faith can speak to and give a better vision and a better way of thinking about sexuality or any number of issues. Those would be some of the practical things I would say.
It's encouraging. And the more I've reflected on it, it seems that there's only one thing that can very effectively cut across the ideological divide anymore, and that is relationship.
Yes.
And it's hard, it's scary at times, So that's why I appreciate that. I think of Rosaria Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. And
Yes.
So against all of our instincts of kind of, just leaning back away from other people, leaning into that. So this has been so encouraging. We've covered a host of topics I was hoping to, and not disappointed at all. So if you had a billboard on which you could put a message to the broader church, what would you put on it?
Yeah, great question. 2 words: faithful presence. Faithful presence. I've used the word faithful a lot. I may have even used the phrase faithful presence in the conversation. That's a real operative paradigm for me as I think about what it means to be a Christian in the world, is bringing together faithfulness on the one hand, and all that means, truthfulness, loyalty, fidelity to the Christian faith, and being a follower of Jesus, faithful, and present, like you're in the neighborhood, you're in the community, you're engaging with people, you're there. You haven't retreated into a monastic, world of your own with other people who see the world the way you do. Rather, you take all that you are and who God has made you to be and what you care about, and you move into the world, not primarily combatively, but as a vibrant presence. So faithful presence would be, this is, Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount. I think this is the vision he casts at the Sermon on the Mount: salt and light in the world.
Yeah.
I think this is, the way I would put it is, that's faithful presence in the world, is to be salt and light in the world.
Amen to that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. Individuals can probably gauge how well you think we're doing that, but that is our vision for Christian citizenship, is to be a faithful presence in the public square. Well, Todd, we look forward to future conversations with you. We'll link
likewise
to your books and to the website. If you had just kind of one place that you direct listeners, where would that be?
Yeah, you go to pastortheologians.com, pastortheologians.com. You can find out about the Center for Pastor Theologians, where I'm at, and find more there about both me and the CPT team and the ministry that we have going on at the Center for Pastor Theologians.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time today. Look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much, Josh.